Egypt reels from its worst attack in modern history. President Sisi promises revenge as fears grow that Daesh is taking over the peninsula. I'm Imran Garta, and today's Newsmaker is terror in the Sinai. They went to prayers like any other Friday, but for more than 300 worshippers, it was to be their last. Dozens of militants stormed a Rauda Sufi mosque and opened fire. The most likely perpetrator, Daesh. As the terror network loses ground in Syria and Iraq, many believe they could be strengthening their hold on the Sinai. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah Sisi promised a swift and brutal response. But was the threat ignored for too long? And will an iron fist retaliation be effective? Shoaib Hassan takes a look.
The terror attack on this mosque was the deadliest in Egypt's modern history. And eyewitnesses say the attackers carried Daesh flags.
They entered the mosque from outside, almost 10 to 20 people with weapons, and they destroyed everything. Some were wounded, but those killed were much more.
Most of the worshippers at the mosque in Bir al-Raid were Sufi Muslims. It's a branch of Islam that emphasizes benevolence, tolerance and self-control, and is seen as deviant by Daesh. Locals say the group had been threatening to attack the mosque and other Islamic celebrations held here.
The mosque of the Ahmadiyya Jaririya Sufi branch, there are celebrations for the Prophet's Mawlid on the square. We were going to celebrate the Mawlid soon. It's supposed to be next Thursday. The attackers don't want us to do this, so that's what happened.
The attack took place in a small town in the north of Egypt's Sinai peninsula. That's where one of the newest and most powerful branches of Daesh operates. It emerged in 2011 as an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, known as Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis. It then broke away from Al-Qaeda and allied itself to Daesh. It now calls itself Daesh in the Sinai and has continued to attack security forces, and recently widened its crosshairs to target minorities and other Muslims. The attack has also raised questions about the efficiency of the security operation that President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has used to justify his crackdown on political dissent within Egypt. Sisi assumed power in 2014 after overthrowing the elected president Mohamed Morsi in 2013. That followed weeks of protests and violence, something Sisi met head-on with force. He's since used the same rhetoric in the aftermath of each such challenge, including the latest.
من كل المصريين لازم تكونوا متأكدين وواثقين في أن المعركة اللي انتوا تخوضوها هي أنبل وأشرف معركة على الإطلاق في مواجهة الشر وأهله، في مواجهة الأعمال الخسيسة، في مواجهة ترويع الآمنين، في مواجهة القتلة، وهنشوف.
The speech was synchronized with air raids involving these Egyptian attack aircraft. The target was said to be Daesh camps and militants across northern Sinai. It's a tried and tested tactic, but one that appears to have had little effect on Daesh in the Sinai. And after this latest show of force, it's still unclear whether military might alone will be enough to end the threat. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from London by Ghanim Nusayba. He's the founder of Cornerstone Global Associates, a consulting firm that specializes in the Middle East. In Berlin, we have Ayman Tamimi. He is a research fellow at the Middle East Forum. And completing our panel from San Francisco is Giorgio Cafiero. He's the founder and CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consulting firm. Thanks, all of you, for joining us. Giorgio, let me begin with you. This was a terrible, terrible attack. Was it an intelligence failure, or in general, is Egypt just generally unable to stop this kind of attack?
To be clear, for many years, terrorism and unrest in the Sinai has been a major problem for the Egyptian state. This was the case not only for Sisi, but also in Morsi and Mubarak, where Egypt's leaders Nonetheless, this attack on Friday in the northern Sinai showed the extent to which years of the Egyptian state's efforts to defeat the forces of terrorism in the Sinai have not proven successful so far. At this point, with the Islamic State losing substantial ground in the Levant, in Iraq and Syria, there is legitimate reason to be very concerned about more of these foreign fighters coming into the Sinai and exacerbating this threat in the future.
Right, and we're going to, sort of broaden it out into what Daesh wants and what ISIS might be doing as they've lost territory in Iraq and Syria, as you mentioned. We'll do that in a few minutes' time. But for the moment, Ghanim, let's look at what Sisi has done in response. He's fired a presidential advisor. He's promised brutal force. He's bombed alleged Daesh hideouts. Is that the right way to go? Is he doing the right thing?
Well, it is the right way to respond to militants. You respond to militants by fighting them. Obviously, this is a much bigger problem than a militant Islamist problem. Daesh is a manifestation on a wider continuum of Islamism that has been brewing for decades, years and decades. And fighting someone who walks into a room with a suicide bomb is the only way to deal with him or her. Mm-hmm. And so part of fighting extremism will have to be a brute military force, but fighting the longer, so the other parts of the continuum, the earlier parts of the continuum, through education, through development, through empowerment of the citizen, of the average person, is also part of the solution to a long-term problem. And I think this is what the current Egyptian government is doing at the moment. So it is part of a longer, much bigger package that has to deal with a very, very complicated problem.
Okay, so let's ask Ayman Tamimi. We've seen brutal force from the Egyptian state in the past. I mean, a few months ago, there was a video that came out that alleged that Egyptian soldiers were torturing and executing Daesh suspects. We've seen them, bomb militants in the Sinai before. So does it beg the question, this has been done before, we've seen this movie before, and it doesn't work because these guys are still capable of going into a mosque and blowing up 300 people and shooting dead those who escape?
Yes, that's very true. And I think the problem we have here is that many times before, there's been this promise to inflict the decisive blow on the Islamic State militants in the Sinai, and then only for it really not to materialize. I mean, another example from earlier this year was the conflict that Islamic State got into with the Tarabin tribe in the Sinai, and there was talk of the possibility of inflicting a decisive blow on the Islamic State. Now, the Egyptian state would have tribal force on its side against the Islamic State in the Sinai, but that didn't materialize either. It does seem very much like the Egyptian state, the Egyptian military's tactics in the Sinai don't amount to effective counterinsurgency.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty pessimistic. Right. I'm pretty pessimistic about prospects going forward.
Okay, Giorgio, let me ask you, the fact that they were more Tasawwuf or Sufi oriented in Bir al-Abed at that particular mosque, is that a clear sign that they were targeted for the Sufi leanings? Or maybe does it have more to do with the fact that the Sawarka tribe was deemed as collaborators and seen as collaborating with the government? Are there more tribal elements or sectarian kind of theological elements here, or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, according to my read, this is a mixture of both. As you said, the cooperation with the government seems to have been a factor. At the same time, we have known that these extremists have held certain intolerant views of Muslims, including Sufis, who are different. So without a doubt, there was an ideological motivation. This was a very big deal that they chose this target. I think this is largely to show the same time that the Egyptian state lacks authority over the Sinai. It's not to say that Islamic State has necessarily created the state apparatus in the Sinai that we saw a few years ago in Raqqa and Mosul. But I think the objective is also to demonstrate, as I said, that the Egyptian authorities have failed to assert their authority over the rest of Sinai.
Ghanim, to what do you attribute that? So Giorgio says that the Egyptian state has failed to assert its authority in the Sinai. What's behind that? Why hasn't it been able to do so?
Well, it's as I said, it's a continuum that that reaches its apex with when you have someone blowing themselves up, and this is the problem with Islamism, looking at life with a monopoly of truth. So whether it's social, political, or militant Islamists, when they have this monopolizing of truth, of rejecting the other, whether they're non-Arab or whether they're Shia or whether they're Sufis, as we have seen in the past few days. And the problem here is that it's a very complicated problem that has been brewing for many, many years and many decades, and therefore has to be resolved through a multitude of solutions rather than one single solution. At the moment, it is absolutely true that the Egyptian state is facing difficulties, but a military difficulty that it is dealing with. Now, it would be wrong to say that the solution the military solution has failed. We're talking about a military solution for a military problem. There is a much bigger solution for a much bigger problem, and it will take a much longer time to develop that through participation, through a secular state, and secular not in the atheist sense of the word, but a secular state in the sense that we have a religion which is elevated to a layer a level higher than politics. That will take a lot of education that sadly is lacking not only in Egypt but in the rest of the Arab world and the wider Middle East.
Giorgio, Daesh, or attacks attributed to Daesh, or those that they've taken credit for, have happened in Egypt, in the cities, in the rural areas, in places like Cairo, Alexandria. In Sinai, as we're talking about now, Copts have been targeted, Shias have been targeted, Sufis have been targeted, foreigners, and so on. Does the Egyptian state have to distinguish between the attacks in the urban centers, like Cairo and Alexandria, and the attacks that are happening in Sinai, given that Daesh seems to be gaining ground in Sinai? Do they have to make a distinction?
Well, I think from a political point of view, the attacks unleashed in Cairo or other parts of mainland Egypt are more costly for the Egyptian leadership. I think many Egyptians who are living in Cairo and other major cities of the country are obviously very, very concerned about what's going on in Sinai. But at the same time, as we have mentioned, there is a long history of terrorism in the Sinai. The event on Friday, although much more deadly than past attacks, was not unprecedented in terms of just being an attack in the Sinai.
Okay, so Ayman, we look at it ideologically. Clearly, these guys pledge allegiance to Daesh. Operationally, how would this go down? Would they do the attack in Sinai on their own accord? Would they do it, without actually having to ask for permission from Abu Bakr Baghdadi or anybody else in Raqqa or wherever they may be? Would they do it? And then will it be celebrated afterwards? Or is there still some operational connection that stitches these people together?
In terms of the relation between what you'd call, Sinai is declared to be a province of the Islamic State. And in terms of the relations between provinces outside of Iraq and Syria and the center, there is something in the Islamic State bureaucracy called the Administration of Distant Provinces that's meant to manage relations between the center and the provinces. So, for example, if you're saying who appoints the overall leader of the Sinai province for the Islamic State, then this is something done by central decision. On the other hand, in terms of daily operations and even say big-scale ones, I doubt that there's a coordination in the sense that the central gives the go-ahead for a particular assault. I think the decision in that case has to be made on the ground, but I think when you think about the ideological contours of what those operations are, so for example, the targeting of Sufis, then that is something, obviously the IS Central approves of it. But in this particular case, though, they didn't even claim credit for the operation. And it's notable that there was even, because of the scale of the killing, probably, there was even some backlash in pro-Islamic State circles, like on the closed forums, so Shumuq al-Islam. So I think that might be why the attack hasn't been claimed until now. Maybe just the scale of the killing and the fact that it can't be framed in the simple sectarian terms in the way that when, say, Islamic State attacks Shia or attacks Christians in Egypt. This kind of attack can't quite be framed in the same way, I guess, because, you know, Sufis, they're still, you know, these Sufis, they're still Sunnis at the end of the day. I mean, they fall in that broad rigor,
Yeah, that's so really, that's really useful. It's really good to learn that. That's very interesting that they are divided, I mean, among their fans, I guess, online. Ghanem, are you terrified that the consensus seems to be, as was mentioned earlier in the program, the consensus by everybody who knows a thing or two looking at this thing is that when Daesh loses ground in Iraq and Syria, as they have lost ground, and they've basically lost all their ground there, the more they will lash out in towns and cities elsewhere, but more than that, they will strengthen their franchises or their provinces, such as Sinai and Libya. So if you're a Libyan or you're an Egyptian, you have to brace yourself for some terrifying times ahead. Are you terrified?
Well, I mean, it depends how we look at Daesh. Daesh, I think we should not look at Daesh as a cause, but rather than look at it as a symptom. It's a symptom. Treating the symptom does not treat the cause. If Daesh goes, there'll be other Daeshes coming afterwards. There'll be Daesh 2 and Daesh 3. Obviously, when Daesh is defeated, and hopefully this will be soon, they will try to fight back. And those who sympathize with it, and if the organization Daesh, and there is no such an organization in the sense that we understand an organization called Daesh, they would find another militant or extremist Islamist home to wreak havoc around the world. And so this is hopefully we're winning the war, the military war, the war against the militants, Islamic militants, but that should not stop us from the other part of the continuum, which if we don't address that, then we will have Daesh 2, 3, 4, until we defeat the much wider problem, and not only defeat it, but get greater engagement from the areas where Daesh has been able to recruit people, whether it's in Iraq, in Syria, or in Sinai and Libya and other places around the world.
Yeah, Giorgio, if the presidential team in Egypt called you in and said, hey, come and sit at the table and give us some advice, what do we do? How can we stop this? What would you say?
I would encourage the Egyptian authorities to view this problem not only as one which requires a military solution, but as your guest mentioned, there are many root causes of the Islamic State crisis in Sinai. In this part of the country, there are issues of poverty, economic marginalization, high rates of illiteracy. There's a very complicated tribal network, and many of the Islamic State figures in Sinai are locals who come from tribes, and they have many of these grievances which Islamic State has absolutely exploited. So I have no doubt that the Egyptian authorities are very committed to fighting Islamic State in the Sinai, but my concern is that when you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and I think there's a big risk that by trying to use more brute force in the Sinai to fight extremists, the conditions that created fertile ground for them in the first place could exacerbate in the future.
Ayman, what does this tell us about the elasticity of the organization, given that in the Sinai, you can have a lot of these people with very, I guess, hand-to-mouth sort of grievances. And then, on the other hand, globally, you could have, I don't know, a kid in Molenbeek who grows up in Belgium who wants to go and fight for Islamic State, and both of them would be generally a part of the same organization. Tell me what it means in this day and age. How do you fight an organization that can appeal to both a Bedouin kid and a kid growing up in Brussels?
I think the important thing is to always address your solutions on the case-by-case basis rather than coming up with one grand panacea. So I mean, in the case of the Sinai, for example, as the previous guest mentioned, there are these issues of underdevelopment and local grievances against the state that need to be addressed. And also, as one of the other guests mentioned, about this problem of ideology and, a wider spectrum, for example, that, say, would condemn Sufi practices, shirk or polytheism, and also, say, anti-Christian bigotry. So, in short, there's no, one simple solution. It has to be addressed on the local level in case-by-case basis.
Yeah, very finally, Ghanim, when people mention that this was Egypt's 9/11 and they see it as a watershed moment, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's not totally unexpected. We've had the bombings against the churches in the past few months, and this is not entirely unexpected. And sadly, I think we cannot rule out any future attacks. But this is a fight that the Egyptian state and Egypt is fighting, and let's hope there'll be more. There'll be less deaths as a result of that. And I think what needs to happen now is strengthening the notion of a nation state, where there is more talk of policy and less of politics, as Hassan bin Talal always says, and that would hopefully bring up the level of discussion into building an Egypt that includes an integral part being Sinai, where there is economic development, which is what the government of Egypt is currently doing. This will take not months, but it will take years, and we just need to be hopeful that there'll be less deaths as this process continues.
Yeah, painful time for many Egyptians, the families of the victims. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you, Ghanim Nusseibeh, Ayman Tamimi and Giorgio Cafiero. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead, is the Me Too campaign against sexual harassment long overdue, or could it possibly be starting to go too far? And could this be the cure for HIV? We speak to the man who injected himself with a homemade gene therapy. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Women from all over the world continue to come forward to share their stories of sexual harassment using the hashtag #MeToo. It began with several allegations against the now disgraced Hollywood film producer Harvey Weinstein. But since then, the number of men accused of everything from catcalling to rape has grown exponentially. The social media campaign is widely seen as a long overdue movement to address deep flaws in society. But there are some people with concerns. Could conflating lewd comments with violent sexual assault end up having a negative effect? Here's Sandra Gatman.
It began with Harvey Weinstein and hasn't stopped since. A wave of sexual harassment allegations is taking down actors, comedians, CEOs, coaches, journalists, and politicians.
And I am therefore resigning as Defense Secretary.
The claims are shattering a conspiracy of silence and shaming men accused of abusing their power. A global chorus of emboldened men and women have spoken out about their own stories, using the social media hashtag #MeToo to expose the magnitude of the problem.
Yo también he sido abusada sexualmente.
We all went out to a club.
Ich gesagt, nein, ich will das nicht. Ich habe mehrmals Nein gesagt.
And then he was like, do you want to go drive somewhere dark where no one will see us?
But while it's being celebrated as a moment of social reckoning, what real change will it actually bring?
We have to get, everyone on board with this, or we're not going to change the culture.
The Oxford Dictionary defines sexual harassment as involving the making of unwanted sexual advances or obscene remarks. But the recent string of media scandals range from lewd jokes to groping to physical assault and rape. The severity of the offense doesn't seem to matter.
It doesn't have to be high level for women to feel under siege. And actually for women, if you're constantly being harassed, even in a small way, that builds up. And that wears you down.
Some scandals involve one accuser. Others involve more than 80 testimonies. Some men have confirmed the allegations. Most have denied them. So when it comes to holding people to account, are we in danger of treating bad manners and sexual violence the same? Without proper investigation, some of the more serious accusations have created concern about the possibility of vigilante-driven trials by the media. This pattern could undermine the legal principle of innocent until proven guilty. There are questions, too, about whether any real action will spread beyond Western society. In parts of the world where the quest for female empowerment and legal protection will be a much longer battle still. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New York is Stephanie Gutman. She's a journalist and blogger who has written about political correctness. And from Washington, Soraya Chemali. She's a writer and activist whose work focuses on the role of gender in culture. I thank you both for joining us. Soraya, let me begin with you. Me Too has exploded onto the scene. It's extraordinary. The cat's out the bag. Has it been a long time coming? And is it a good thing?
So I think Me Too is the culmination and one more movement in a long process of what people think of as hashtag activism that actually has very deep roots on the ground. So I do think it's a good thing. I don't think that it's a necessarily new thing to people who've been doing this work. The hashtag was started many years ago by a woman named Tarana Burke in a different context, but with the same emphasis. And so we have Yes All Women, we have Not Okay, we have many other steps in the process of getting here.
Mm-hmm. Stephanie Gutman, you've written about this. You're not too keen on the Me Too hashtag. Tell us why.
It's too broadly defined. The severity of the charges don't seem to matter, and very little fish are being scooped up with a few big fish.
Interesting. Okay, so let's ask
Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah. Okay, let's ask Soraya about that, right? So you have this principle. A lot of people say there is a problem, but on the one hand, you have sexual harassment, which, as bad as it is being maybe conflated with violent rape, all under the same hashtag, and that can't help anyone. Is there some truth to that, Soraya?
So I think we're mixing a lot of apples and oranges. There are the legal issues, the social issues, the cultural issues. This is a hashtag that is meant to shed light on behavior that has for decades hurt and inhibited many people. And I think we need to categorize it for what it is, which is not a law situation, not an HR situation. The hashtag was started online as a way for women who have always culturally, historically been silenced in the face of these kinds of abuses to share their stories en masse. Because one woman standing alone and saying that these things happen is never enough in our culture. It takes dozens, hundreds of women saying the same thing to be able to confront the word of one man in these situations. So I think that we need to be very specific about that. As far as quote-unquote innocent people being caught up, I think we have to be very careful about using that word. For decades, very talented, very ambitious people have lost opportunities, lost jobs. We as a culture have lost their work, and nobody really pays much attention to that. So I agree that we need to be cautious as to the kinds of inhibitions that result in the workplace from abuses, but I don't think we've gone nearly far enough to appreciate the way that these kinds of abusive behaviors trade in the continuum of behavior that Stephanie talked about.
Okay, so Stephanie, why can't we deal with both at the same time?
Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. So Stephanie, why can't we deal with both at the same time? With the stuff that is maybe creepy and distasteful at best, and the stuff that is, you know, properly rape on the other, why can't we say, hey, we want to solve all of it at the same time and be able to categorize as adults? Why not?
Because they're radically different. And anyway, we have criminal laws governing rape and battery and actual assault, but we get in big trouble when we start criminalizing and using criminal language around the kind of misunderstandings that occur between men and women in the workplace and outside of the workplace. We just lost one of our best journalists, Glenn Thrush.
So that might be Glenn's situation. Soraya, what Stephanie's saying is that we're casting a really wide net and it might be a witch hunt. Why aren't existing laws against rape and harassment enough, I guess?
In the case of Glenn Thrush, there was not just one incident, is my understanding. There were several. And while some of them may appear to be nuanced, the fact is that it was a systemic pattern of behavior, and that women in these spaces, not just at the New York Times, but at the New Republic or at NPR or any of these other media outlets that have been named, have repeatedly described the need to have whisper networks and to warn each other about the behavior of men, and to understand quite clearly that their professional lives were being imperiled in situations where they had very little control. And so when we talk about the loss of work or the loss of income or people supporting their families, we need to remember that women are doing all of those things. They're experiencing all of those things, but they're experiencing them in settings, certainly corporate settings, where men, overwhelmingly white men, make up between 83 and 93% of corporate executives, managers, newsroom editors. So, you know, to compare what happens to a person in a bar where they're out socializing with what happens to a person in the workplace where these types of power dynamics are diffuse is really not fair. These are totally different things happening. And so if we are uncomfortable with what is happening right now to men who are being named for their egregious behavior, then what we need to think about is how we fail to provide systems and procedures, which gets us to the law. In this country, only 3% of rapists ever see the inside of a jail. In more than 50% of states, they're allowed to sue for custody of children. The law fails rape victims, male and female, every single day, 24 hours a day. So falling back on laws that are already faulty is really not going to help us in these situations either.
Okay, so Stephanie, we have to...
need a soup-to-nuts discussion about sexual ethics and its relationship to male power.
Okay, so Stephanie, we need to fix a culture more than we need to fix laws, which is harder.
I think, if anything, our culture has veered way over to an extreme of people defining themselves as victims and defining minor slights as, you know, major injury. If anything's wrong with our culture right now in the U.S., that is the problem, you know, an excessive sensitivity, an excessive, you know, sort of determination to be offended. And I think, you know, as a culture, we need to lighten up quite a bit. You know, this is sort of the ultimate white people's problem. I mean, all of this shrieking about, you know, being taken out to lunch by your boss and him trying to make a date with you. You know, is that really something that's going to scar you for life? If so, you're way too sensitive to be in the workplace to begin with. That's the problem in this culture.
Soraya?
So I think that there's a basic disconnect, obviously, between our worldviews. I think women should be allowed to work unmolested. And if men can't go to lunch with them without asking them out to lunch, then they should maybe not be in the workplace. I mean, we need to reverse the trajectory of the situation if all we think we're talking about is oversensitivity. We're talking about people's physical safety. 1/3 of women who report harassment say that they fear for their physical safety. We're talking about people's ability to earn a living. Over 40% of households are now headed by women in the workplace. We're talking about the ability to be successful at work. We know what these hierarchies look like. We know that we don't have workplaces that welcome parents, men or women. We know that we don't have workplaces that welcome women as leaders. That much is clear from the facts. Congress is 83% male. Corporate America is between 83 and 93% male. These aren't oversensitivities we're talking about. We're talking about harassment, bias, discrimination, and yes, they exist on a spectrum. All things are not equal.
Stephanie, let me ask you, if we come out of this, right, come out of this moment, and we see that the courts and employers tend to take harassment and sexual assault a bit more seriously, men who would normally be a bit creepy are less creepy, what's the downside?
Well, first of all, I think that the courts and society as a whole has been taking sexual harassment very seriously for a long, long time. I really don't recognize the world that Soraya describes. It's almost like something from the 50s, and it's certainly not the America that I know and have worked in for, you know, a long time. I studied the military. I wrote a book about the military. If anything, the military is now oversensitive about sexual harassment. It defines sexual harassment in some of its training manuals as glances that last longer than 3 seconds. It defines sexual harassment as, you know, it can include jokes, can include all sorts of things. Now, I think that's a little extreme of a definition, and certainly women in the military are encouraged, and you know, there's all kinds of infrastructure to encourage them to report and to try these things. So I don't think we need at this point to add any more.
So let's ask Soraya. Yeah. Soraya, this is not Mad Men in the 1950s. It's a different world. There are laws and there are sensitivities. And Stephanie feels that there's an exaggeration of a system that by and large works. It might be unfair, there might be anecdotally problems, but by and large it works, and you want to try and change it. Why?
I don't really think it's working for the majority of people. I mean, I've rattled off a whole lot of descriptions of what our institutions look like. And I don't think that institutions that are so profoundly lacking in diversity in their leadership are working for the majority of Americans. I don't think that institutions that systemically inhibit women from accomplishing their ambitions and from serving in full capacities, in professional capacities, are serving the needs of most people. I don't think that legal systems that exonerate 97% of people who are charged with rape are working. I don't think that living in a society where between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women are battered, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted, 1 in 6 women are stalked, I don't really think that's working for most of American society.
Okay, so Stephanie, I know sometimes sampling the noise on Twitter, you get the feeling as if it's a lynch mob, and I get it. I mean, I go onto Twitter, and it does seem like that on a multitude of issues. But sort of tuning out the noise for a second, and given that this kind of, you know, we're in the heat of the moment, right? Down the line, isn't it a good thing if something chips away at anybody's abuse of power, whether a man or a woman, something hangs a question mark over anybody potentially abusing their position of power? What can be bad about that?
There's nothing bad about that, and that's great. And if, you know, this whole thing, you know, reminds people to be courteous and civil in the workplace, that's a great thing. I don't know, I've been in the workplace a long time, so, and this whole idea of early childhood education sounds very totalitarian to me. I mean, we have early childhood education. If our primary schools work correctly, children are socialized to be, you know, good and respectful people. I don't know we need anything sort of gender specific or gender based. if anything in this country, little boys are being sort of systematically beat up. A woman named Christina Hoff Sommers wrote a really brilliant book called The War on Boys. And I think that we need to correct a pendulum that swung way too far in the direction of sort of telling little girls that they're great, and and stop punishing little boys and stop punishing men. I know that men in 2017 feel very, very beat up. I think it's one of the qualities that influence the Trump vote. A lot of men just felt aggrieved. A lot of white men feel that they sort of are taking the heat for stuff that they shouldn't be taking the heat for.
Okay, so let me get a final response, because I've got to wrap and I've got to move on. Final response from Soraya. In trying to address problems of the patriarchy, are we finding, I don't know, are we flipping it? Are we flipping it and maybe creating unfairness on the other side, as Stephanie is alleging?
I think that we need to be specific. In the United States, because we have a very diverse community, population, we can't really talk about the patriarchy without talking about white male supremacy in this context, right? Those two things mutually construct each other, the sexism and the racism. I don't think that we have any pendulum swinging anytime soon in the direction of altering this power structure. I think it will take a very long time. Patriarchy also hurts the dispossessed, whether they're male or female. It hurts poor men the way it hurts poor women. But power accrues almost universally to elite men. And in this country, that means elite white men. And I don't really think there's any doubt that that is the case. Yes, we have our Melissa Mayers, but there are more men named John, more men named Dick, more men named William than there are all women CEOs in the United States. And to highlight one or two women who are overrepresented in media is only to try and deny the facts on the ground that there are so few women in leadership in any sector of our economy. That's not really a matter of opinion. That's just the fact of the way we're organized. I do think boys are hurt by norms of masculinity in our country. I think that they are aggrieved and have reason to feel great distress. But that does not mean that they do not get paid more or that they don't benefit from the biases that result in the kinds of long-term power imbalances that we see. I also think that the effort to address any of these problems really does have to happen in early childhood education. I don't think our early childhood education is providing enough guidance in these ways.
Okay, Soraya and Stephanie, I've got to move on, but I thank you both for your patience and for joining us here on the Newsmakers. You came at it from different frames of reference, but I think it was important to have the conversation. Thank you very much for joining us.
I'm excited about the possibility of potentially curing this, maybe for a few months, maybe for a few years, maybe indefinitely, but there's only one way to find out.
A single shot to eliminate HIV seems too good to be true, right? Well, self-styled biohacker Tristan Roberts thinks it could be possible. Last month, live on Facebook, he injected himself with a gene called N6. He hopes it will help his body produce an antibody that fights the virus that causes AIDS. But not everyone is on board. Why? Because it's untested and unregulated. Roberts is part of a growing community of biohackers. They believe they can get medical cures to the market faster and cheaper than others held back by regulations. But many in the medical community are outraged. They call Roberts' behavior delusional, risky, and frightening. Let's speak now to the man himself. Tristan Roberts joins me now from Orlando, Florida. Tristan, thanks for taking the time, to come on the Newsmakers. You've injected yourself with genes. You haven't turned into a comic book villain yet, I don't think.
Not quite yet.
But tell me why you decided. I mean, this is a brave thing to do. Some people will think it's stupid, but it's undoubtedly a brave thing to do. Tell me why you've decided to do this against medical advice.
I think we really can't wait for the established players who are making huge amounts of money from treating HIV to develop an actual cure for HIV.
But are you suggesting that they don't want to?
I know many of the researchers are passionately trying to find the cure, but the amount of institutional, resistance to change is there. It's very real. And even if we cannot get this cure, it takes millions of dollars to test out a new therapy, right? It takes around 5 years to test out a new therapy. And the reality is that people are dying, every day because of this illness. And some of it just because they can't access it, but some of it because they can't afford it, right?
Right.
So it really just depends on the market. And this current therapy that I've been testing out, we're pretty sure that the cost to manufacturing it will be less than $1 per dose.
Yeah, just directly, has it worked at all? I mean, have you done tests afterwards?
Yeah, I've been getting tested regularly since the injection. I've seen that my CD4 count has risen, which is a indicator that the virus is not being able to attack my CD4 cells, not being able to attack my immune system, which is encouraging. However, we might have to use multiple genes and multiple antibodies in order to suppress the virus.
Right. Now, I understand fully that you want to cure yourself. It's totally understood, right? I mean, it's deeply personal to you. There's I guess, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, there's a desperation to it, right? And an urgency, of course, right? You want to stay alive. You want to be healthy. But according to the best available science out there, ARVs are the best bet for now. They're not perfect. They're not going to cure HIV. They're going to give everybody an opportunity to live a better life and be healthy. That's the best available alternative for now until we can all figure this thing out. Why don't you accept that common consensus?
To be clear, I was on traditional medication for 3 or 4 years, and it was very successful. But the side effects are real. And more importantly, the costs are real. In the United States, this medicine is around $2,000 per month. And even if you can acquire the medicine, it's still supporting a system that I feel is inherently unjust. So the current system, the current medication, it is all right, but it is definitely, there's definitely room for improvement too. And I've been unmedicated for the past 2 years, and my health has been fine. So I think I'm in a relatively good position to be able to test out something that's experimental.
Right.
I'm personally not, in a state of desperation right now.
Okay.
When I started the medicine, my viral load was very low. My immune system was very high. So I feel like I'm in a good position to be able to test out new therapies that could benefit people who are in more dangerous, more desperate situations.
Okay, so yeah, and maybe, forgive me for suggesting desperation, but your stake in this is that you have HIV and you don't want to have HIV anymore, and you're willing to, I guess, take the risk. That's why you went on Facebook Live. That's why you injected yourself with gene therapy. Let me turn it a little bit to the issue of expertise here, right? And again, I don't mean this to offend you, but you're not a genetic engineer, you're not a doctor, you're not a scientist of any sorts, right? Now, I could see a space rocket that has a huge problem and a major fault in the engine, and I could be very frustrated that nobody's fixing it or they haven't identified the problem, but I would never think for 1 minute that I would have the slightest clue about fixing that engine, because I have no clue. This is nothing to do with my domain of expertise. Aren't you going into this a bit blindly and naively because you don't have the kind of medical and scientific knowledge to back this up?
I'm working with a team of biohackers who are skilled both through, their own learning and also through institutional learning. I'm just sort of the front man for the team who don't want to necessarily disclose their identities yet until we have sure success. And to be fair, we do plan on having clinical trials. It's just a matter of we want to make sure that we have something that we're pretty sure is functional before we proceed with that. And we want to engage people in this dialogue from the start and be transparent about it.
Do you see yourself as a sort of pioneer with biohacking becoming the future?
Yeah, that's really the greater issue here is not necessarily curing HIV, but really we're at a point in humanity's history where we're no longer slaves to our genetics, right? Where we can change what is going on in our body at a very fundamental level. And the possibilities are beyond just curing diseases, but also enhancing humans in ways that it's hard for us to even imagine right now. And I think it's just crucial that we're doing this with transparency and accessibility rather than allowing insurance companies and drug companies to sort of be pushing their own agendas.
It's interesting that you talk about insurance companies and drug companies and big pharma and so on, because you clearly don't like them. I'm utterly mortified at the idea that some tyrannical nation state will have this power at some point in the future. That's not going to be nice. That's not going to enhance humanity, is it?
It really, yeah, it's a matter of people being able to choose their own path, right? That's really what's important.
Okay. Tristan Roberts, I wish you all the best. I wish you good health. And I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, did the United States dramatically underplay the civilian death toll in the fight against Daesh? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.